Back in December of 2007, when I was 17, my mum, my sister Andre, and our cat Whiskers had all moved to Staten Island into a 4-bedroom and 1-bath house. We couldn't afford to buy a house and ended up finding one that was up for rent for a pretty reasonable price. Staten Island is also known as the Forgotten Borough and is also considered the most suburban part of New York City. My mum had always wanted to live in a house, especially in Staten Island, since most of our family had already lived there. The street we lived in was really quiet and decent looking, and was also a dead-end street. All the houses had their own unique styles, and you could tell that they had been there for quite some time. There was one house in particular on the street that looked really strange and abandoned. The house did not look like the usual houses in the neighborhood. Some of the windows were boarded up, and the other had broken and dirty white blinds on them. The paint on the side of the house was tearing off, but you could tell that the house was once a baby blue color. The front of the house looked like a tornado had went through it, and the grass looked like it hadn't been cut in years. Needless to say, there were also 2 abandoned cars in it, one of which was a 1961 black Chevy Impala that sat in the driveway of the house, and the other was a 1959 red Cadillac that sat in the tall grass in the backyard of the house. We just thought that the house was abandoned and that the people had left years ago. We all had hoped that someday someone would clean up the property, renovate and sell it. I was also fascinated with the house though. I wondered if it was haunted, had anyone died recently or years ago there, what valuables were left behind. I would often try and go and peek through the broken blinds, but saw nothing but darkness, even in the daytime. It wasn't until one of these moments when I saw a light flick from the upstairs attic in that house one late night. I was a huge fan of horror movies, and felt like, at that moment, that I may have seen one too many or something. I was up doing a late assignment while watching movies and must have been tired, so I thought. I peeked through the blinds of my window, and it was still on. I ran into my mother's room and told her about the light, but by the time she had gotten up, the light had turned off. She went outside and searched around outside, but found nothing. But I saw something as she came back into the house. There was an old Volkswagen pulling up to the side of the abandoned house with the headlights on. A family with a husband, wife, and 3 kids got out. The 3 kids were older girls. One was a teenager, the other looked to be preteen, and the youngest had to be about 7 or 8 years old. They dressed differently, like they were from a different time period or something. I just thought maybe they were just religious and didn't believe in certain stuff or something. They all looked disorientated and dazed, but it was also 1 in the morning. They never said a word. They just went into this abandoned house, and for the first time in 3 months, the lights all came on, but went off in seconds. My mother stood there in shock and could not believe that these people lived in that house. Maybe it's nice on the inside, my mother said as she shrugged her shoulders and went back to bed. At this point, I was even more fascinated. We had never seen these people, ever. And obviously, they would come out mostly in the nighttime and rarely in the daytime. I used to wonder if the kids were homeschooled, or maybe attending boarding school and coming home once in a while. Whatever it was, they were pretty creepy and weird. My mother, sister, and I started nicknaming them the Addams family, and calling their house the Addams family house because it looked exactly like the structure of the house they showed on the TV. And those people were weird. We never knew their names, and even the kids never said anything, and you would think that they would be the most interactive ones. But no, they were just really quiet, and things just got creepier. One day, I noticed a foul odor coming from somewhere. We couldn't find it, but it smelt like death, like an animal had died. My mother opened one of the windows in the house and was shocked to see a swarm of huge flies flying around the basement window of the house next door. When you looked at it, you could see the flies on the inside of the house, as well as on the outside. It really creeped us out. We didn't call the police, but we were really scared. When my uncle came over for a visit later on that day, we told him about the incident. Now, my uncle is a skilled hunter and survivalist, and he went around to the neighbor's house, and the smell was so horrid that even he threw up. We ended up calling the police, but by that time, the smell and the flies were already gone by the time they showed up, and so there wasn't anything that they could do. One night, the day before Thanksgiving, my mother and I were preparing some food for the next day. My mother likes to get a head start on the cooking, and we were expecting a good amount of people this time. Aunts, cousins, uncles, and older siblings. My cat Whispers suddenly let out a yawl and began scratching at the door to let him in. Once I opened the door, he jumped into my arms and wouldn't let me put him down. I held him as I peeked through the blinds to see what had spooked him, only to see a man dressed in dark clothing that seemed to be staring back at me. He then turned his back towards me and faced the house. I told my mother what had happened, and she told me not to worry and that the whole family was creepy and needed help. My cat let out another yawl and then started meowing uncontrollably and still did not want me to put him down. When I looked towards the window, I noticed orange flames in our window. Is that a fire?
Mum, I think there's a fire outside.
My sister, mother, and I, with my cat in my arms, ran outside. The next door neighbor's house was on fire. It was engulfed with flames and now it was on our windows. And the man I saw just stood there with no remorse as his entire home burned. As his home burned, his face glistened along with the fire and the moonlight as he looked back at me with dark hazy eyes. I will never forget that look as long as I live. The police and fire trucks got there just in time and were able to put out the fire, but the house was really badly burnt. To my surprise and my mum's relief, the fire only touched our windows and didn't do much damage to our house. But within the moments of us looking at the house and the police coming, the man had suddenly disappeared without a trace or sound. The cops weren't able to catch him and continuously sent patrol cars to watch over the house. They asked the neighborhood questions about the people that lived there. The crazy thing was that no one knew who they were, how long they lived there, and where they might have gone. It was just a total mystery. That family had suddenly vanished without a trace. I also found out through an older lady that lived in the neighborhood since the 1950s that a family had once died in that house in a fire back in 1963, and the family had 3 daughters. And can you believe it? One was a teenager, the other was a preteen, and the youngest was about 7 or 8 years old. She said that the father was a very sinister and overzealous man who controlled his wife and family. She also said that even though the fire was ruled accidental, she had no doubt in her mind that the father was the one who set it off in the first place. Eventually, the cops grew tired and stopped coming around. They had no leads and no one was coming forward. And the house laid vacant, just the way it was when we first moved next door. After a few quiet months, my mother decided to move the family again this time to a house that she bought just on the other side of Staten Island. As we were leaving the house that night during the late summer of 2009 and packing the rest of our things into the U-Haul, I could not help but look at the abandoned house just once more. And as soon as we drove away, the light in the attic of that home flicked on again. It was summer, I believe the day after the 4th of July, and my husband and I were in the middle of a crossroad country trip. We were driving through Texas, and for any of you who have driven across the entire state of Texas, you know that it is a very long and very barren drive. Sometimes we'd go hours without seeing anything at all, and the towns we did pass through didn't consist of much more than a rusty old gas station and a few dusty little houses. Looking out the window, you would swear that you were just driving through the same 5 miles of desert again and again. I had started getting a headache, and my husband suggested that I take a quick nap to get rid of it. I remember allowing myself to doze off as I watched the beautiful colors of a desert sunset. The slowing of the car woke me up, and the first thing I noticed was how dark it was. I believe that it was around 10 p.m. My husband had stopped at a gas station with a small shop. He told me he was going to grab us some food and asked if I needed to pee. Knowing I might not have another chance for quite a while, I went into the shop to use the restroom. Both the men's and the women's restrooms were down a little hall from the open area of the shop. I was groggy and tired and realized how badly I needed to pee, so I shuffled into the restroom. As I made my way through the short distance from the door to the nearest of the two stalls, I made eye contact with a woman coming out of the only other stall. She didn't quite look homeless, but she was definitely messy looking. She had wild grey hair, almost shoulder length if it hadn't been sticking out every direction from her head. It looked like it hadn't been brushed in weeks. She was wearing ragged-looking clothing, a pair of ill-fitted black workout shorts, and I remember noting her foam flip-flops. There were several layers on top, one of them being a large purple and green coat. Keep in mind that this is Texas in July. The jacket was just hanging on her shoulder, crooked like she hadn't bothered to take a few more seconds to put it on correctly. She was also carrying something in a tied-up plastic grocery bag. I gave a quick smile as our eyes met, and she just stared at me in return. Then her face turned wild and intense looking. Her eyebrows were set as if she was angry, but her eyes had a wild, alive look. She looked at me like she was hungry. And this is when I felt the first tinge of something was wrong. I just tried to brush it off though. She waddled over to the only sink and I took my time shutting the stall door because something about her posture in front of the mirror struck me as odd, and I was trying to figure it out. She was standing with her body more angled toward me, but her face was turned to the mirror. Her body was tensed, legs slightly crouched as if she was ready to act or something. Her hands were not by her face or trying to fix a mess of hair or even being washed. They were at her sides, elbows also slightly bent. I wasn't sure why, but I suddenly felt uncomfortable. I regretted leaving my purse and cell phone behind. I shut and locked the stall door and took my time using the toilet. I wanted her gone before I felt the safety of the stall. I stayed there long after I had finished, but the woman was still there, so I waited longer. Finally, I heard the smacking of her flip-flops as she made her way to the door. I heard it open and then slammed closed. The door was pretty heavy and had slammed the same way when I had entered. I stayed for a moment and allowed the wave of relief to wash over me before I reached for the lock, and then paused, fingers only an inch from the lock. I stayed as silent as I could manage to confirm what I had just thought I heard. It was breathing. The woman had only pretended to leave. At this point, I was scared and confused. Why had she tried to trick me into thinking that she had left, only to stick around and be as quiet as possible? I knew something was very wrong, so I stayed in the stall even longer, and this time it must have been at least 20 minutes, but I had no way of knowing for sure. I could tell from the direction her breathing was coming from that she had positioned herself in the far corner, right next to the door, but far enough that I couldn't see her feet. Finally, I heard her leave. This time, I waited a few minutes to make sure that she hadn't tried a trick again. I slipped out of the stall, quickly washed my hands, and rushed down the hallway to the store. It was pitch black outside, and I had no idea where she was, but I knew that she couldn't be far. A large man was checking out at the register, so I waited near a window display until he left the store and quietly slipped out of the door behind him. And sure enough, crouched right outside of the front door is the woman. She seemed surprised as she stood and turned away, walking quickly around the side of the store. My husband was waiting in the car and asked me if I was okay since I had taken so much longer than usual, and I said I would tell him all about it once we were away from that store. Other people who have heard my story have had many theories, but the two most common were that she was a druggie that wanted to mug me, or that she worked with sex trafficking or something. I'm open to any of your theories and would like to hear some suggestions. I tried to see if there was anything in the news from around that time, but I couldn't figure out exactly where we were when this happened. This story is about my mum. She's been living in the same house for about 12 years now. It's in a shady neighborhood. Lots of gang activity and sirens can always be heard not far away. I can't count the number of times the convenience store across the street has been robbed since we moved in. But we were never really concerned, as my mother created an unquestionably comfortable home, and I always felt safe. In 2013, when my father died, she adopted a dog for company, as it was just her living in the house at the time when this incident occurred. The dog is yappy, sweet as hell, but any sort of noise outside, whether it's a car door slamming or our mailman, she will bark, and bark, and bark, and bark. This can be scary if it catches you off guard, or if it's late at night. But of course, it's also reassuring that she is so alert. And that is exactly what happened. My mother told me that it was late one night, maybe 2 a.m. She was getting ready for bed. She stays up late watching investigative Discovery and the like. There are 2 doors that must be open to get inside the house. The front door has a large window and opens into a porch where she keeps her deep freezer. There is a larger metal door after the porch, which opens directly into the living room of her house. She locks it every night before she goes to bed. She likes to sleep on the couch in the living room. She claims her bed upstairs hurts her back. So, one night, all of a sudden her dog started barking her head off. At first, my mum scolded her, assuming that she had heard a car pass by or something. But then, my mum heard it too. Someone was knocking on the front door. The doors had muffled the sound of the knock, but it was someone knocking. My mum sat there silently contemplating what to do, and hoping whoever it was would just go away. But it persisted, as her dog did. Now, my mother wasn't born yesterday. She's a tough old bird, and won't take anyone's shit. She opened the metal door and went to the window. Lifting the blinds, she saw a disheveled girl standing on the front step. My mum thought that she was perhaps drunk, as she was unsteady on her feet and slurred when she spoke. My mum asked what she wanted. "Is Danielle here?" the woman asked. No, there's no one here by that name, sorry." My mum responded politely as she dropped the blinds and was about to go back into the house. But then, the woman started pounding on the door this time, with force. Lots of force, in fact. My mum thought that she had been kicking it.
"Let me in!"
She screamed. At this point, my mum was irked. She goes back to the front door, lifts the blind again, and adamantly tells this woman to fuck off, that there's no one there named Danielle. This woman finally left, but it wasn't until the next day that my mum realized the trouble she could have been in if she had opened the door that night. Her front yard is surrounded by a short metal fence, about waist high. She gives us hell any time that we forget to close the gate. And when she was retrieving the morning paper, she noticed this woman had left the gate open. Annoyed again, she put on her slippers to go outside to close it. And that's when she saw it. Laying on the ground beside our walkway was a crowbar. My mum then understood what the force was that was used to pound on the front door. She had no idea that the woman was holding it. The window itself can see a person on the other side from about chest up, and it had been dark. Who knows what could have happened if my mother decided to open the door that night. This memory of mine begins about 3 years ago when I graduated high school. I had grown up with my grandparents, but decided to move to a different and much larger city to live with my dad for the first time in 12 years. I somewhat knew the city already because I spent my summers with him, but this would be the first time I would have the freedom of an adult. To come and go as I pleased, drive my car anywhere, smoke cigarettes whenever I wanted. I was really excited, though sad to leave all of my friends. As soon as I was settled in, my dad and stepmom sat me down to discuss the few rules and what I needed to know about the complex. Basic things like, go wherever you want, but let us know when you leave and when you're coming back, even if it's 2 a.m. Oh, and you'll have to park on the street because the apartment complex is limited parking. One more thing. There's this neighborhood creep. This guy, George, was well known to all the women in the complex, as well as the police that patrolled the area. He was tall and fairly huge, very intimidating looking. My parents were pretty certain that he would leave me alone for one reason: my dad. Though George had a habit of stalking other women in the complex, he would stop and find a new target if they had a man to make a show of being in their place. It could have been a brother, a lover, or a father. It didn't matter what he was to the woman or what he looked like. George would just simply back off immediately. Since I lived with my dad, who is also quite tall and rather big, or intimidating, I felt confident that I would be alright. And I was, for a time. It started about 6 months after I moved in. My stepmom and dad were fighting a lot more until she got up and left him. One night I was sitting on my porch having a cigarette and browsing Facebook or whatever. I wish I could say that I felt like I was being watched, but I probably just looked up because I felt a bug or something. George was standing about 15 feet away, a little bit behind a tree, just staring intently at me. I nearly dropped my cigarette, and shakily, I stubbed it out and just went inside. I was home alone, so I made sure to lock all of my doors and then played a video game in my room. I told myself that I was probably just paranoid. The next morning, I got up for my morning cigarette and coffee, and lo and behold, minutes after I got onto my porch, George came ambling out of his apartment to look my way. I sucked down my cigarette and went back inside. This pattern continued for a couple of weeks. It was like George stood at his sliding glass door, peeking out, waiting to see when I would pop out. I told my dad about it, and he tried to sit with me whenever I went to smoke. If he came with me, George wouldn't even peep a head out of his door. Of course, the other women in the complex had already tried to call the police about George. But he lives in the complex, and staring isn't a crime, so there wasn't much that they could do. I didn't know how far George had taken it with other women before, and with that info in my mind, I knew that calling wouldn't be much use. Things slowly escalated. Once my stepmom left, I had access to a parking spot, so I had 3 ways to get from my car to my apartment, depending on how I parked. One of the ways went just past George's apartment, about 5 feet from his door. Since I got off work late most nights, I avoided that route as much as possible. Slowly but surely, like he memorized my schedule, he would be on one of those paths when I was coming home. Not directly on the concrete, but a few feet away on the grass, behind a tree. It was like he thought that I couldn't see him. I mean, picture a child hiding very terribly behind a tree. You can see 90% of their body, and you know that they're there. That's what he would do. I would rush past him, avoid eye contact, but prepare to scream if I heard him coming after me. I started to carry my keys between my fingertips. I bought a pocket knife, and I would walk from my car with it halfway open already, even though I've never been in any kind of fight in my life. Around this time, I believe, my mum was trying to find me some free self-defense classes, since I couldn't afford anything on my tight budget. My dad was steadily getting more and more pissed off as George edged closer and closer, escalating as the days went by. It went from November all the way to May. If my dad wasn't home, I would lock my bedroom door and keep my knife under my pillow. I would Skype all night with my boyfriend, just so someone could call 911 for me if they needed to. I even put a bunch of flower pots in front of my bedroom window so no one could get in silently. I started sitting on the floor of my porch below the wall, out of sight to smoke, but angled so I could see him if he walked up to it. I had terrible nightmares too. Then one day, my neighbor, Shell, was gossiping to me. "Did you hear about George?" No. He got arrested last night. In the complex parking lot, there's a sort of big electrical power box. It stands about waist height and is perhaps 2 or 3 feet wide. About 10 minutes before I was supposed to come home and park right in front of it, some lady with her kid walking by saw George sitting on the box, masturbating. Was he waiting there for me? Jerking off to the thought of me seeing him there? Ugh, the thought of it makes me want to puke and scares me all at the same time. I was relieved for a few days of my stress, but it was only a few days that he was gone. And then he was back, and he went right back to the same old routine. One night though, he got far braver. It was maybe 7 p.m. when I went out for a cigarette with my dad. A neighbor walked up to chat with my dad, and George came outside and stood out in the open, staring me down. "That dude's asking to get his fucking ass kicked," my dad said under his breath. Then he chatted to the neighbor some more. I rolled my eyes, went inside and played some more video games. I was healing in a World of Warcraft dungeon when I heard Shell shouting,
"Where are you?"
But I was healing, a pretty important job, and I figured that she was just talking to someone else. That is, until she burst into my room in a panic, her eyes huge. She hopped from foot to foot frantically like she was doing the potty dance or something.
"He's bleeding!"
"Who?" I asked in bewilderment.
"Your dad! Come quick!"
I made some teenager huffing sound and left my computer, certainly pissing off the rest of the group. I grabbed our little first aid kit filled with band-aids. I thought in my mind that my dad was doing something stupid, like tossing up his pocket knife and trying to catch it or something. But when I stepped outside, I found myself face to face with a real horror. About 6 people surrounded my dad, including Shell, and my neighbor Caleb held a shirt to my dad's side. He was facing away from me, and his entire back was just covered in blood. It looked like he'd been mauled by a bear or something. That was seriously my first thought. Caleb's hold on the shirt slipped and blood sprayed everywhere. I feel queasy even writing this down. I have never in my life been the person people turn to in an emergency. I mean, blood makes me lightheaded, and I have anxiety attacks over not being able to find a specific bookmark. But all of the adults, people around 30 or 40, while I was just 18, around me were panicked, aside from Caleb. I needed to be the person that people turn to. I threw the first aid kit onto the porch and told Shell where we keep our towels. She rushed to go and grab one. "Has anyone called 911? I shouted. 5 pairs of eyes turned to look at me like they'd never heard of 911 before. "No," my dad said. "I can't afford an ambulance." "Shut up," I said. "What happened?" "That fucker stabbed me." So I dialed 911 and relayed our address and reason for emergency. The operator told us to keep applying pressure to the wound on my father's lower back. My dad is a true champ. Even though the sidewalk was just one big puddle of blood, he stayed on his feet until someone thought to run and get him a chair. I ran back and forth along the walkways to get the police and show them the house that George lived in, and then I ran back and forth to get the paramedics. They were so cold and so agonizingly slow. They walked calmly, and I wanted to scream at them to run. I mean, my dad could be bleeding out. Don't they care? I learned later that they don't run because if they do, they'll let their adrenaline kick in, and mistakes can happen. They shoved Caleb out of the way because he refused to let go of my dad's wound and got him packed into the ambulance. I was about to jump on when the police stopped me and told me that I had to stay so that I could give them a statement. My dad shouted at me to call his boss, and I remembered all of his allergies and whatnot for the paramedics. 2 years later, and all of these details have been burned into my brain. I gave my statement to the police, then they made me sit outside the complex on the sidewalk for 2 to 3 hours. They kept me updated on my dad, and once I called his boss, my boss, and answered my stepmom's message, that's when I allowed myself to break down. It felt like I cried forever. One of the cops was nice enough to go into my house and grab my cigarettes and a bottle of water for me. He stayed with me the entire time to make sure I didn't run off or something, but he was really nice to me. He offered to let me sit in his cruiser a few times to get away from the cold. George was waiting in his apartment when they came. When they took him out to where I was, there were 14 cop cars. 14. He still just kept trying to stare at me. I stared right back and felt so much hatred like I'd never felt before. I wanted to just go over and kill him. My babysitting cop looked over and saw that George was staring, so he used his flashlight to keep George from being able to look at me. Once it was all over, I was allowed to go back to my house where I waited for the information about my dad. I gathered the story from my neighbors while he was in the hospital for 9 days. He had shouted at George to leave his daughter alone, and George had shouted back at him while I was in the house, totally unaware. George said something along the lines of, "Come tell me that to my face like a man." So my dad hopped over the porch and waltzed up to him. The creep had been waiting with a 12-inch blade held to the side of his leg. He struck out with his empty hand and then got my dad in the back with the knife. It missed his kidney very, very narrowly. It travelled up and punctured his lung and damaged his diaphragm. My dad didn't realize that he had been stabbed at first. He got George into a headlock and pummeled the shit out of him, thinking the dude had just punched him in the kidney or something. George dropped the knife, rolled in the grass, and picked up another knife he had been hiding and stabbed my dad again, this time in the upper back. This wound was much more shallow, but still required stitches later. At this point, Shell came outside and screamed to my dad that he was bleeding. He took off his shirt, got pissed, and threw it at George. At that point, the neighborhood stalker put his hands up and went into his apartment. The blood stayed on the pavement until about noon the next day, when my neighbors kindly washed it off for me. I still have pictures in my email of it, as well as my dad's injuries. My dad spent more time in the hospital in critical condition than George spent being held in jail, unfortunately. I feel like it was my fault. I've been addressing that in therapy, but I still feel awful about it, like my dad had to fight my own battle for me. Throughout the week, while I was on my porch or just outside, I had so many women come up to me. They all told me to thank my dad for them. They had all been terrorized by George at some point, and now they were certain that he would be away for good. Several poor women had had George stalk them up to their apartment door and pull his pants down, demanding sex. I still can't believe that the cops couldn't do anything. One of those days, one of my neighbors came up to tell me that the police and neighbors had searched the complex and found that George had stashed many knives all over the place. They were buried in gardens, stuck behind trees, under his doormat, everywhere. I shudder to think that he might have planned to one day grab one of his targets and do something far more sinister than stare. George was declared guilty for battery with a deadly weapon, but the attempted murder charge was dropped. He was out of prison by Christmas on good behavior or whatever, but my dad and I have a lifelong restraining order against him. He has never tried to come after me, so I can only hope that he's terrified of my dad now. I wish I could tell you guys that I took self-defense classes and learned to fight the way my dad can, but I'm still a pussy who can't even slap a spider, so there's that. My dad is doing all right now. He's just had his third surgery on Tuesday, trying to repair the damage done to him internally. We're hoping that this will be the last, and his quality of life will vastly improve. I probably owe my life to my dad. If he hadn't have fought George for me, maybe I would have been the first victim George stabbed.